Hey everyone, welcome to the Orbital Media Podcast, where we learn about human perspective, culture, and story one interview at a time. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please consider doing so in order for us to make more content in the coming weeks and months. Now, in this episode, we are going to be talking about Jewish identity and what it means to be Jewish. This is going to be part of a longer ongoing series, but today I am joined by Rachel Hirschkopf. Rachel, could you tell the good people out there a little bit about yourself?
Oh, okay. Hi, my name is Rachel Hirschkopf. I'm originally from Canada. I now reside in Los Angeles. I came out here to work in animation. Right now, thankfully I'm doing that. I'm just an assistant, but it's going great. And now I'm here with Chris.
Yes. Well, thanks so much for being here, Rachel. So my basic question for you is, so you are a Jewish person. Mm-hmm. It is a very, very key aspect of your identity and how you see yourself in the world. You're from Canada originally. Do you see yourself primarily as a Canadian or as a Canadian Jewish person, or do you see yourself primarily as a Jewish person of the world who happens to have been from Canada?
Right. So this is actually this is going to be a long answer to that question because there's a lot of things tied up into that. So number one, I'm very proud of being Canadian. I also happen to be an American citizen. I'm also very proud of being American. I see Canada and America as being great countries. Like truly, they all have their flaws, they all have their issues, but really in terms of like people being able to do what they want to do with their lives, and I'm very proud to be citizens of both those countries. There is a really interesting, we're digging into the heavy stuff a little bit early, but there has always been this historical, we're really digging in, historical disdain for Jews, especially Orthodox Jews in cultures because, they always see that Jews aren't fully patriotic. There's the sentiment that Jews aren't fully patriotic to their country. They're always really patriotic to whether it's their religion or whether it's to Israel, which are equally tied up in each other. And so there has been a long history of people saying that Jews aren't, committed to their countries and won't follow the rules of the country. That has led to a lot of anti-Semitism. But it's a chicken and the egg situation where why is it that Jews, tend to be, I love being American, I love being Canadian, I love Canada. I also love America, but I genuinely love Canada. But there is a fear. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors. My whole childhood, we're learning about it. And a lot of Jews, especially, you call like Ashkenazi Jews, I can speak to specifically, there's a lot of fear around, a repetition, another expulsion. Especially now with the rise of anti-Semitism, there's a lot of this feeling of, I love being here. I love this country. And I even have friends who are like, they would serve in the military. They love it here. But if things got, a lot of anti-Semitism, as we've seen throughout history, rising now, that, at least we have Israel. Yep. At least we have our culture and somewhere to be that. And Israel isn't just, a random piece of land that was picked. It really is core to our culture and religion, in our prayers every day for the last, thousands of years since Jews have been expelled from Israel. We do have prayers of like, if only we can go back to Jerusalem, if only we could go back to Israel. So it is very complicated because we love, I'm still here. We have a land in Israel, but I'm still here because I love it here. But there is, a part of the identity that's always going to be tied up in Israel and the culture, and really feeling, even though I'm not technically an Israeli citizen, I know that it is another home for me.
I mean, because it's sort of an interesting dynamic between you having a Canadian passport, American passport, but also having sort of ties to
like the safe knowledge
of like, I don't want to go so far as to say it's like the homeland, but sort of this idea of, I think of that in terms of my own identity and a lot of other people who have moved or whose families have moved from other parts, right? There's like the country that you originate from, and then there's like the US and Canada and whatnot. But in terms of, I guess, the dynamic between even like, is there a difference in any way you felt between Canadian Jewish and American Jewish, or is it like not really?
You mean religiously or like socially?
Or just in terms of like the sense of like the populations, like when the stereotype right of sort of like there will be slight differences between like Americans and Canadians as macro populations, but like specifically for like Jewish identity, when you feel you're talking to Canadian Jews versus American Jews, is there like much of a difference, or is it more just
I think overall, not necessarily. The biggest difference would be, and I'm not really answering the question, but it is just demographic wise. Like let's say the Canadian just population, the demographics are very different than, well, I can only speak for LA. It's the only place I've lived. But like, let's say in Canada, I don't think I've ever met Persian Jews.
Right. Okay.
Like we don't really have Persian Jews. We don't have, Yemenite Jews as much, at least from my experience. It's a lot more what people call like Ashkenormative, which in Toronto, Canada, I can't speak to the rest of Canada, Toronto, Canada, than it is, in my experience, in Los Angeles. But in Canada, people, at least in my community, we tend to have more what people would perceive of like white passing Jews. And then here you see a lot more diversity in skin tone and also language, honestly, which is very cool. That's been like, I grew up in a community that was very, I'll use the term again, like Ashkenormative, in school, most of us were Ashkenazi. And here it's very cool to see, in the synagogues and stuff, there's a lot more diversity.
And also just very quick, do you want to quickly, for people who maybe don't know, going through the terms of like Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, like what that...
I don't feel like I understand it enough to be able to do that. Can I just be, and I can even say here that like, I think actually you would be better at defining, because you think more like, in like terms of regions and history. I don't really think like that. So
I can give it the old college try.
Yeah.
So here's the best that I can figure. And obviously in the comments, if I'm wrong about this, please let me know. Just please be respectful. I'm doing my best, but this is what I got.
Chris is very educated.
I just want to be, I just want to like set, kind of the parameters. So we're clear that I'm going in with some education on this, but I don't have like a degree on the topic, which is, so Ashkenazi Jews are basically people who live in or sort of resided in Eastern and Central Europe. So think like Russia and Germany and Poland and, Hungary and places like this. In the, you use the terms, right? When people think of, white European Jews, right? They are thinking of Ashkenazi Jews. When you think of a European person who's Jewish, you are thinking of an Ashkenazi person. There are other categories, however, of Jews as well. There is a category of people called Sephardic Jews, who are, and this is, again, I want to be as clear as the limits of knowledge kind of are for me, which are people who originally were Jews from Spain or Iberia in general, many of whom were then expelled from Spain by the Catholic rulers, and then often went to other parts of Europe or sometimes the Middle East. So it can be a little hazy, but at least the way I tend to think of it is Sephardic Jews, I almost think of as like Mediterranean Jews. People where they might have the phenotypes of someone from Spain or southern Italy or Greece or, Israel, sort of the Levant, that kind of area. I tend to think of people like that as being Sephardic Jews. And then you got Mizrahi Jews, which in a macro sense are people in places like Iran or Persia, or at least used to be. We won't go there. Maybe we will in a future episode. I'm really down to go there actually, but maybe not now. We're just starting out. But people who lived in places that they largely don't live anymore. For certain reasons.
Not of their own volition.
Not of their own volition, yeah, exactly. But what I'd almost broadly categorize as Middle Eastern, or maybe even more broadly, Asian Jews. People from the continent of Asia who were Jewish. Broadly speaking, I would think of as being generally Mizrahi Jews. Yeah. Now, if I'm wrong on any of that, if I'm missing some specifics, please let me know. I'd love to get your thoughts on that, dear viewers. I'm doing my best here, but that's generally the sense that I have of those three populations. Yeah. Think of it broadly as sort of European, Eastern European, Mediterranean, and then kind of Middle Eastern. Yeah. Asian.
And like, so the history a little bit there is that, and like I mentioned at the beginning, Jews have been kicked out of a lot of places, but Old Testament times, Jews were in Israel, and over time, different, it's split into two kingdoms. And then one kingdom at a time, essentially all the Jews, majority of the Jews got expelled. There have always been Jews in Israel since then, but it's a very small population because of the expulsion, because Jews what they kind of did is they took populations and switched them, swapped them with each other. That was like a very common thing that was done so that, they couldn't really rebel.
And not just for Jews, by the way. Often people in the past, that was just done for any population.
It's incredibly strategic.
Yes.
And my family is just groups of Jews who, my family tree is, we made our way to Europe, and so it's good. We give a.
Exactly.
We got there.
We got there, guys. We got there. And then we got to the Americas. Also, really quick, what are we drinking?
It's called Tubi. I don't know a lot about it. It is delicious. Like if you ever grew up with like a parent that put like lemon in Coke, like in their Coke Slurpees, like if you mix it with Coke, like that's what it tastes like. It's like a lemony, a little bit spicy, like gingery.
Yes.
And what it is, and this is me quoting people who are quoting other people, but apparently there is some herb that it's made with that until recently was potentially illegal here.
Okay.
Hearsay, this is all hearsay.
That's all hearsay, yeah.
And it gives you an amazing, this I can say for sure, it gives you a little bit of a high when you're drunk.
Nice.
So I love drinking this because my drunk is going to be the best.
Perfect.
And you don't need a lot. It's 40% alcohol. So you do like 1 or 2 shots.
Yep.
I usually drink it with Coke. So it's like I sip it.
We're doing it straight.
We're doing it straight. You can
on ice.
also do shots.
Yep.
But it is, you either love it or you hate it. So good. I don't know. You had a
It's
sip.
good. It works for me. It works for me.
Let
It's
have some.
yeah, and it's from Israel. It's an Israeli drink.
Wow.
Yeah. So we figured
I forgot that it's like a little spicy.
It's it's got a little kick to it.
A little spicy.
But what's so interesting is the fact that it has in some ways the feeling almost of like, I don't drink a lot of liqueurs, but I think of liqueurs as being not like hard liquor, where they're a little bit thicker and they're a little bit sweet and they've got like other flavors and stuff. This tastes much more like a liqueur, but it's 40% alcohol. And a lot of liqueurs generally aren't. They're more like 20% or 20 something.
And it's like refreshing a little bit because it's ginger
and it's a refreshing drink. So anyway, we're not getting paid by them. This is not a product placement.
It's really good though.
But it's really good. Yeah, Tubi, drink from Israel. We figured it was fitting. If we're talking about, Jewish identity.
Yeah.
So the other aspects too that I obviously want to get into with you is the fact that you are not just Jewish, you are a subset of Orthodox Jewish. Yeah. Do you want to like give us a little opening on what that is, or what that is in your case?
Okay, so I can say what it is in my case, and it's there are different levels of orthodoxy. The one that people see the most in things like, when they're watching a show like Shtisel, I don't know if most people know what that is, Unorthodox, or, all those kind of shows. That is kind of more of like an ultra-Orthodox sect, even though they're various sects, but people look at them and think they look the same. So all good. But so I'm a sect that people usually call like Modern Orthodox. So what it is the base teaching of it, it's based on like a very specific rabbi that kind of started this movement, which is that it's orthodoxy. So we follow biblical Torah law, which is for us, that's First Testament. First Testament and teachings around that. We follow the law, but it's also very focused on living in the modern world and how we bring that into the modern world. There are a lot of groups where, for very good reason, and they have their own systems. I'm not necessarily going to sign up for those, but they're a little bit more isolated.
Many of us would not. I would not sign up for those.
And they're a little bit more isolated, a little bit more insular, because they don't necessarily want to be part of the modern world. A lot of it is because it's post-Holocaust, fear and different things. But the sect that I'm part of is very much about like go out into the world, but bring your religious, perspective into it. It's not about proselytizing. Judaism is not a proselytizing. If people want to convert,
of course,
okay,
yes. No, it is it's almost an anti-proselytizing.
Yeah, well, because it's really hard. So there is like in Judaism, if people want to convert, people are allowed to convert, but there's like a rule where the rabbis have to say no to them 7 times because it's hard. And in Judaism, we really believe that if you're born not Jewish, that's not like a bad thing. It just means you have a different path. And as long as you don't, like, there's like seven things that people who aren't Jewish should do, but they're like, don't kill, don't steal, like, don't cut a limb off of a live animal, leave it, and, it's like, don't do adultery, so they're very basic things. And it's like, as long as you're not like a horrible human being, you are great, do your thing. You don't have to be Jewish to like fulfill what you needed to do in this world. So what I say when I go into the world, it's not like I'm going and trying to convert people. So that's very much like my sect of Judaism. It's just really about like, how do you get a foot in both worlds? And I feel like we might be going down this path a little bit, which sometimes can be, easy and sometimes can be hard.
Well, the thing I'm curious about, and let's say this is in your case, this is modern Orthodox, if we'll call it that way. Even so, compared to your default person that you might run into, are there things culturally where you feel very distinct? Like, I have to do this thing. I've got to do this.
Got you.
Here's a celebration we have. I talk to people, they have no idea what I'm talking about.
This idea.
That kind of stuff. Yeah.
People don't think about the code switching we have to do, but my name is Rachel. It's not Rachel, but people can't pronounce my name. So I have to kind of anglicize it. So that's like the most like basic thing. Like as soon as I introduce myself, there is like a distinction. But there is, I keep kosher. Which in its most simple elements, most people think, kosher means like a rabbi blessed the food, which I don't know where that came from because it is literally like not even a part of it, but it's basically separation of meat and milk. There is a special way that animals need to be slaughtered, and that it's done by hand, and it's done in a way that the animal feels the least amount of pain. And then those are like the two most, and then the only meat we can eat has like split hooves and chews its cud, so it's like a cow or like a goat. And those are like, so kosher is a big thing, we've had events where we've gone out to eat and I come with my little lunchbox with my own food. And that's it. Listen, I mean, that I will say the eating thing is can be very alienating. So that's like a really big one. Like at work also, we do like lunches, and I always have like, it used to be, luckily they paid for my food, which is really nice, but I've had in internships, we order food for the whole office, and then we go right into the meeting, and I'm a few minutes late and I get yelled at because I can't eat the food they ordered. I have to run to the fridge and take my food out, and I couldn't do before because I had to be working. And so that can be like very, I've gotten yelled at for like, coming in like a minute late just because like I can't eat the same food. So like that also in terms of, I guess this is less so in my life, but modesty, I guess, in terms of, like there are a lot of modern Orthodox Jews that wear pants. That's totally cool, totally chill. There's just different people do different things. But for me, I don't wear pants. I wear skirts. I try to cover, the modern Orthodox community in Toronto tends to be more religious than it is here. So this is on the more, in Toronto, this would be like more modern than modern Orthodox, but here it's like modern Orthodox, exactly. So, but I feel like just like in terms of, I think food, I think also just people don't always understand when I have religious holidays. A lot of times I think, I've learned how to manage this, but when I say like, oh, I can't work because I have a religious holiday, they assume I'm like, it's like Christmas or something where I'm like hanging out, just chilling. Like it's like kind of like a normal day. But for us, our religious holidays are, there's a concept, we're digging. Okay, there's a concept in Judaism where, most religions have this, God created the world, Whatever religion you're gonna have, there's a concept of that. So God created the world, and what it is he created us in our image, and we are also creators, which is super cool. We can make things and do things, and it's awesome. And so throughout the whole week, we do work, we do it, and on the Sabbath, it's the time where we say, we sit down in our humility and say, we aren't the ultimate creators. So we refrain from doing acts of creation. People usually say like, oh, we don't do work on Sabbath. But, people are like, well, turning on a light isn't work. Or, driving, walking to this place is much harder than driving. It's much harder work, but it's not work. It's acts of creation. So we don't like turn on the lights or anything. We don't write because that's like an act of creation. And it just, so all of our religious holidays are like that. Where we can't drive, we can't use our phones, can't use our computers. It is really cool. Whether or not you're Orthodox Jew or not, you should, it's a cool practice to have in your life where you just don't use any of that kind of technology. And, it's great. We play board games, we talk, we go to synagogue, and there really isn't any distraction. You're very present in the world. And so all the holidays are really like that, where we're not doing, even if I wanted to work during my religious holidays, I couldn't, I can't turn on my computer. So that has that's a very big difference where I see that people just don't understand it. I've had professors be like, well, I mean, if it's important to you, I guess you could take it off. And I have found, a mix of reactions from very accepting to actively aggressive and upset. But, it is what, listen, anybody who's any religion with a practice, I'm sure plenty of Muslims could talk to it also, where they have things like that as well.
Yeah, and it's also, I remember, it's also for Saturday in general, right? In your case, it's not just religious holidays, it is also on a weekly basis.
Right, on a week, from Friday, basically sunset, sunset to sunset, so 25 hours. Every single week, and because time sun sets earlier, different times or later, so it changes throughout the year. But it's a weekly thing, and then we have our religious holidays throughout as well. A really long. Sorry, I get very excited.
No. I'm curious also in the pre-modern world, if you go before electricity, if you're not able to use fire, the scenario would have been similar to that, where people are basically just sitting in the dark.
Yeah.
They're eating cold food, and that's just what they have to do one day a week.
I mean, but that's also, there's this Jewish stew called cholent, which is there's versions of it. It's very cool. I was talking to people. every Jewish culture of its, the Ashkenazim call it cholent. We all have this version of cholent. What's cholent? It's basically everything you have goes in a pot and it sits overnight. And so my father was telling, through my grandfather, but what they would do is the baker, I think something that the ovens would still be on or they'd continue running, or it was so hot that they would stay hot over Sabbath. And before Sabbath, everybody would take their pots with whatever they had in it and bring it and leave it. And then on Saturday, they'd come pick it up. And that's how they had hot food on Saturday, which I think is like very cool. And every single Jewish culture and group, regardless, has a type of this stew that's eaten on Saturday, which is very cool. That I don't know if it's like they were doing it in biblical times and it just carried through, or like each group was like, oh, just it makes sense,
Yeah, and actually to that point about food, I'm curious, and again, there's a wide range. It's not just like, there's Jewish food, right? But there are different types and regions, and it's been influenced, obviously, whether we're talking, Ashkenazi or Sephardi or Sephardic or Mizrahi, where they will be influenced by the cultures and the cuisines of the region they live in. But like in your case specifically, so we'll say, and I know you referenced the whole like Ashken normative, which I've never heard that term before. I always just heard Ashkenazi, but I get your point, because it's viewed as like, the default setting of Jewish culture, at least in like the Western countries. But like types of food and drink that you find are very particular to your community and that outsiders view sometimes as like unusual, like they've never seen this kind of stuff before.
So I can only speak to Ashkenazi food. There's a lot of Sephardi food that I've had, and it's so good. But
just focusing on
so number one is
no shakshuka.
Yeah,
no. We're not talking about shakshuka.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I didn't even know shakshuka is so good. Very Israeli, very Middle Eastern.
Yes.
But so first is when you think about Ashkenazi food, delicious, but it's like what you think of like white people food a little bit more, so like not as many spices, a lot. It's salt, pepper, onion powder, garlic powder. That is our core. That's what we had. We had potatoes, and root vegetables and that. So things that are normal. So chicken soup, right? Everybody knows about chicken soup. There's also this thing called gefilte fish, which has got a really bad rep. Whenever I see videos of people eating it, what they do, and I hate this, don't do this. They buy the jarred stuff that no self-respecting, maybe I shouldn't say this, human being, no self-respecting human being should ingest. Let's put it that way. Yeah. They should not. It's gelatinous. It's gross. It's dense. Don't do it. Don't eat it. They always have it. I don't know who buys it. I think people who try to try Jewish food in videos and eat that, I think that's the market for those. Don't eat that. Yeah. Gefilte fish is this delicious, it's basically a loaf. It's like ground fish with like some like carbs, like flour. And it's really good. And I mean, I've never made it from scratch. We buy it from the store and then you boil it with onions and carrots and you slice it up and it's so good. So like that, herring is a big thing. I don't know if that's like a Jewish food, but like European. It's European
in general.
So herring is a big thing. And then potato, like potato kugel. So there's this joke song in Yiddish, and I'm not going to sing the whole song, but basically the whole song is, on Monday we eat potatoes, on Tuesday we eat potatoes, Wednesday, Thursday we eat potatoes, but on Shabbat, on Sabbath, we eat potato kugel. Yeah. And that's the joke, So potato kugel is just, it's like latkes if you've had them, just, grated potatoes and then baked into like a little cake, kind of,
Yeah, interesting. I mean, because they're always, so I grew up in New York, where again, family's not Jewish. I got Jewish cousins, but I'm certainly familiar with certain dishes or types of food that, certainly for the New York City area, and I think Montreal also to a degree, are almost just viewed as associated with the city, even though they derive as originally Jewish food, and that would be for dessert. You've got like rugula, which are or baked goods, really. But
I don't really know. I didn't grow up eating. My mom was very, so I never grew up. But I don't really know those foods as well. But I will say it was. I don't know if this is true. I saw an Instagram story about this, so may be true, may not. But so I've always, bagels and lox. People think about that as being very Jewish. I always was like, I don't know if it's actually Jewish, but I feel like maybe Jews adopted it. But apparently, historically, Eggs Benedict were very popular, and they were served in some capacity. I've never had Eggs Benedict, I don't know, with meat of some sort. Great. And so what Jews started doing is, because we can't have meat and dairy kind of together, I don't know what's in that dish or how it would be served. So instead, they replaced it with...
If you want to know what it means, it's Eggs Benedict. It's basically, you're going to have, and not technically a crumpet, you're going to have what's called an English muffin, which is not a crumpet, but it's sort of like it's a little sort of bready roll kind of thing. And you split it open, and then you put down a slice of ham, usually kind of Canadian bacon. Then you put basically a poached egg on top, and then you're going to put hollandaise sauce, which is sort of this very kind of creamy, vaguely mayonnaise-esque, but not exactly, type of sort of slightly tangy, slightly sweet. It's more like it's like a thinner, runnier, sort of lemonier mayonnaise, and you drizzle that on top, and then you maybe put it's delicious, and then you maybe put some fresh greens or something like parsley or something on top, and and you eat it. Yeah,
so we don't eat like bacon. So unfortunately, I will not have a true. So I guess this, so at least according to this thing, it's that the idea of like bagels and lox and maybe cream cheese came in later. I don't really know, but was because that was very popular and Jews couldn't eat it, and they would do it with lox instead.
That would make sense. And also the fact that, the concept of the bagel is a very Eastern European food like that. And that's not even aside from Jewish populations. That's just like Eastern European populations in general.
And it could be that Jews, when they first came from Europe, they were like very industrious, and they started, it could be that, and that's why Jews are so associated. That feels true.
Well, and the fact that if you just, like with a lot of these sort of quote, American imported dishes from Europe, often there will be elements from different regions of Europe that existed separately, and then once that population shows up in the US, they're kind of putting things together, and then all of a sudden you get like this dish that like you wouldn't have. But again, like smoked fish, super popular in Europe, Northern Eastern Europe, like smoked fish is everywhere. Way more so than here. Again, bagels, very, very common, or that idea of a round bready roll with a little hole in it, like very common in Eastern Europe, and like lots of different forms too. And you throw it together. My sense in a lot of cases of Jewish food, like virtually most of the culture is you're doing things out of necessity because you're extraordinarily short on resources. Whether because of your environment or because of the populations that are, going after you. And so you have to make do with not a whole lot to get by.
Yeah, and I feel like in a big way, regardless of, how bagels, lox, and cream cheese, or Jews as bagels, became popularized. I will say that religiously, there's a lot of like religious events where it really makes sense. It's like, what should we serve? Well, bagels are easy. Like, a lot of celebrations that happen like during the day or whatever. It's like, that's easy, doesn't have to be heated up, and we can just serve it to a lot of people. So it also makes sense that like Jews would after, like a circumcision or whatever, like that's very common to have that kind of food. And in Judaism, also after people pass away, it's a tradition where you eat circular foods, but like eggs or rolls or bagels, because it's like to symbolize, that life goes on in the cycle of life. So it really makes sense, and like Jews would maybe potentially even disproportionately serve bagels at life.
Like a funeral, basically,
sort of funerals, or babies are born, or things like that.
Okay.
So
interesting. Yeah. You mentioned certain aspects of food. There's even like like rugula or something too. Yeah. Or I said rugula. Hamantaschen.
Yeah. Oh, right. That's funny. I do. Yeah.
Hamantaschen, which is another thing. Sort of this little triangular kind of like fruit filled sort of little pastry dishes.
And so well, I want to go back for 1 second, just because I was saying before, I noticed arugula, like Jews call it rugelach, because that's part, right? We have the cha in our, and it was just funny, because now that we're talking about these kind of things, I'm like, oh yeah, it's also, like we call it rugelach, because that's like the cultural, and that's our language. But hamantaschen, I don't really know. I know why we eat them. Did we invent them? I
don't know. That I couldn't tell you much more than what it is.
Yeah, but we in the same way that we eat latkes on people know more about latkes on Hanukkah, because it's it's about whatever. I won't go into it, but basically we try to use a lot of oil for reasons that are related to the holiday, and we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But so we eat hamantaschen on Purim, because this is another time
And what is Purim?
So Purim is a holiday that's celebrated. There's an old joke, which is all the Jewish holidays are, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. So this is very much quintessentially that holiday, where basically I was actually talking about.
And what time of the year is this? Is this?
Oh, it's before Passover.
So like March.
Yeah. And so essentially what it is that this is just another example. This is in Persia. This is supposed to be, it's like the parents of Cyrus. Don't know which, I know there are multiple Cyruses. The one who built the second temple. who allowed the Jews to go.
That's Cyrus the Great. He's the one who's like the A-OK guy in everyone's histories. Yeah. The one Persian ruler that everybody loves.
Yes. So this is basically, in the time right before Cyrus, the king had an advisor who, saw that it was to his benefit to basically kill the Jews. And I actually, when I said before, one of the things that he said, which what I gave an example of, is like the Jews don't even follow your rules, which they do. We live by, in Judaism, there's a very big law about following the law of the land. It's a very big thing. And so he was like, they don't, they're not even really from here. They came from Jerusalem. They were exiled, whatever. And so he was, going to kill all the Jews. And then it just happened to be that one of the king's many wives, happened to be Jewish. He kept it a secret. And she was able to use her position in order to kind of thwart the plan and make it so the Jews were not killed and were victorious. So why at least do we tell kids and why do we eat, the hamantaschen is because apparently, I don't know how historically accurate it is, but at least, they say that the hat, so the guy who wants to kill the Jews named Haman, and he wore a hat that was kind of that shape. So we kind of eat that to it's like we're, it's like, Judaism is very into, we're very into symbolism. We have one holiday, Rosh Hashanah, which is like our New Year, but part of the meal, it's just puns. It's just, we eat food. So like I'll give, all of them are in Hebrew, but there's one that's like my brother, he made this, and a lot of people have also made this, but it's like, we eat raisins and celery. I'm like, why do we eat raisins and celery? And my brother made this up. It's like, so we have raisin celery, right? It's a pun. So Jews are very into puns and symbolism of food. We love to eat. And if we can add religion into the food, even better. So so that's what hamantaschen are. They're very directly related to, that's why they're only really made once a year.
But that idea, not to switch gears to, let's say a headier subject, which we sort of opened with, which is this idea, right, which is a really, really unfortunate aspect of being Jewish, of it kind of feels like everyone's out to get you. And you're like, well, God damn it, How does that affect, even living in a place like the US and Canada, how does that affect the way you go through life? The way that you interact with not only people in your community, but even people who are not Jewish, let's say, but they're, in the US, they're in Canada, or whatever, or even strangers, people you don't know.
Listen, I know, the way people perceive Jews is very specific, and I know when people think Jewish, they think white. That's the first thought they have, even though Jews are, as we started off, you go to Israel and it's so...
There's a range. Yeah. Oh, that was the other thing, actually. Yeah, there's Beta Israel. You've got Jews who are from Ethiopia. Well, again, most of them, I think, now live in Israel. There are a couple there are some, but it's not a lot. It's not a lot. But yeah, you have African Jews who are from Ethiopia. The feeling of people being out to get you, and often that being based on pretty clear evidence that that's a real threat. How does that affect the way you go through your life as an individual?
So it's a very weird and scary thing knowing that when you come into a space, and I'm a lot more confident about being Jewish than I ever was before. But I've been in lectures. I have a friend who is I think he's what is he? He's like Taimani Jew. He is not visually white. He is not, and he's been in classes where the professor's like, all Jews are white and they're oppressors, and he's just like, I'm a Jew, I'm in your class, I'm not white. Not all Jews are white. Literally
this sounds like a great class. I'm sure this professor didn't have an accent, Ryan.
I know, and listen, you meet, I know Persians who they're my parents' age, and they're like, yeah, we have to leave on the back of a camel in the middle of the night or else we'd be murdered, right? So there's a lot of different, people, and the way people perceive, Jews, I know, is just incredibly, privileged and very rich. And there are reasons why maybe that perception started out, and I, we don't have to go into histories and understanding, but for how I go throughout the world, when I was younger, I used to be very frightened, especially when I was applying to programs for college and doing my master's, leading with the fact that I'm Jewish and the fact that I'm Orthodox. I usually wait until after, I'm accepted to something or a job has accepted me and sent me paperwork before I'm like, by the way, I'm Orthodox and I have religious holidays because, there is discrimination and there are issues. And the truth is, if they gave me a hard time for it, I would fight or I would, leave, and I don't put up with that kind of stuff anymore. Definitely not. But yeah, like, listen, you know, I walk down the street, you know, on Shabbat, and when cars drive by, I don't know if you ever walk down Pico, where, you know, a lot of Jews are, you'll see that more and more they're starting to build these like metal poles so that cars can't ram into pedestrians. And that started in Israel. That's a big thing around bus stops. They have these big pillars because people would just run over civilians. And you know, here we've had some attacks, and you know, I remember my first year here. It was right after there was a shooting in a synagogue, and I remember it was Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, one of our high holidays, and I was praying, and all of a sudden all the lights went out, like the power went out, and everybody kind of like paused, and you could see that everybody was like, is this going to be an attack? And you know, and everybody, you know, like you could really feel everybody rallying. They're like, okay, if we're going to be attacked, at least we're going to continue in our service. But there is, you know, a very acute, and whether, you know, I think a lot of it, you know, we'll say there is a lot of warranted, you know, Jews are disproportionately have anti-Semitic attacks and different things to other groups, especially to our population size. We're like 0.0 whatever it is, something, you know.
In the global population, it's like 0.1, 0.2%.
We are very small, but the disproportionate amount when you look at reports of, and this isn't to say that other groups aren't also attacked, and that's not to put down the plight of other groups that really do suffer, but I think that the issue with Jews is that people look at us and they're like, you guys have no issues. You guys, you know, it's okay to be anti-Semitic to you guys. But it is, you look at all the reports, it's disproportionate to our population. And it is scary. I have a friend who got, you know, they tried to beat him up. You know, most Jews aren't as muscular as he is. He's very muscular, and he was able to fight his way out. And the other guy ended up in the hospital, and not him. So yeah, it's definitely something that I hold with awareness. But at the same time, you know, I wish, you know, I actually am a little bit jealous of boy Jews, weird way to say it, because male Jews, because they wear, I guess you guys would call them skull caps, they're called kippahs, and they're identifiably Jewish. And I've spoken to my friends recently, and I'm like, I wish I had something to wear that when people saw it, they knew I was Jewish. Because as scary as it can be, it's not just my religion, it's my identity, it's my world, and it's my life. And, you know, and the older I get, the more I want people to know that I'm Jewish, and I want them. And listen, I've also had people meet me and they're like, oh, like you're Orthodox, but you seem so normal. Like, and I'm like, well, like, I don't know that, but like, we're just also people, you know. I really have a lot of resentment against shows. Ooh, this might get blacklisted. Against shows like, Unorthodox is more nuanced, and you should read the book. I think it's I have issues with the show, but the book is like a really touching, incredible story. But shows like Modern Orthodox Life. And you see me here, I'm very modern, I'm out in the world, and I have friends who were students of the woman who is in that reality show, and they're like, oh, like in our community, people wore pants, and there were musicals in the school, and it was very modern. So it's more modern than I am. And then she turns around and she's like, well, I wasn't, and people can have their own experience. And it is, you know, especially when you're younger and you don't understand why you're doing things, and you don't really have as much autonomy, it can be very stifling. I'm not gonna deny that. And some people, like if you read Unorthodox, she was very stifled, and people have real stories, but I hate it when people are just like, you know, just bashing on Jews and Orthodoxy, and it's just not even accurate what they are showing. And that's very, you know, my Orthodox life is that my friends who are in my community are like, oh, I know her. She taught me, and she was like, it was in a modern school. And yeah, so, you know, and that doesn't help with anti-Semitism and anti-Orthodox sentiment.
Right, yeah, I mean, I suppose there's sort of I suppose it's probably for an average person, there's not much of a distinction, but I mean, I could see there being sort of anti-Jewish sentiment, and then there's anti-Orthodox sentiment. And it even gets, I mean, complicated, because my understanding is, I'm trying to learn more about sort of Israeli politics and what's going on there. Like, that gets really interesting. Because there you essentially have all of these different factions, and there you'll have like people who are secular Jews and people who are like, we're not down with that kind of stuff. And it's increasingly becoming a kind of a problem actually in Israel between the ultra-Orthodox and kind of everyone else who is running Israeli society. So it's again, that's a specific case. I get for your, you know, an average person who's doing awful stuff here, it's like they're not making that distinction. But
listen, also, like, you know, two Jews, three opinions. You know, and Israel's a very good example of what happens when you have that mentality in running a country.
But so that idea of your identity and how you feel like you had a lot of fear, but you, as you get older, you think it's more important that people know that you are Jewish and that you're Orthodox Jewish. And is it sort of a sense of like, I refuse to live in fear kind of an idea?
Yeah. I mean, there's this big concept, not concept, something that I've picked up on, which I don't think is new. But, I'll tell a short story. I was in university in Toronto at York University. There's a lot of anti-Semitism. And my first day in school, I come in and there's this big mural on the wall of basically the presentation. I don't want to get into politics too much, but basically of...
I mean, if you want to get into politics, like, go for it. Like, part of the reason I'm doing this channel is because, like, I'm very tired of, like, towing the line of, like, yes, and this thing, like, while not being, like, a horrible reactionary person. I don't want to be some angry YouTuber where you're just but I'm also just, I think, having open discourse about like, here is a thing actually that's not cool. And the fact that it's not like a politically correct thing for me to say that it's not cool that you're doing this, like, I'm getting very tired of that. Yeah. And so, yes, so let's go.
So let's do it. I'm going to say it with the premise of the Israel-Palestinian conflict is very complicated.
It is very complicated.
A lot of innocent people on both sides are being hurt. And there are also, a lot of people that don't care about their own citizenry. And I don't think that the average population is, let's say, because let's say I'm not representing Israel, but as a Jew, people perceive me as, I think that the innocent, Palestinian people who just happen to be suffering as a byproduct should not be suffering. And so I go into school, and what is this huge mural is, it's showing, what's meant to show, poor Palestinian farmers being run down by Israeli tanks, and then all the Palestinians are holding rocks behind their backs with their tanks. And this is, there's a history in Israel of, we've had like intifadas and different things, but basically of civilians basically being like murdered on the street. And for me, walking into a school where it's also the presentation of like, Israel as like the very wealthy, big oppressor and whatever. We can, and I have so much to say about this topic, and we don't have to go into it.
We can get into it in future episodes if you want to, because I'm down.
Let's get into its most basic elements. I am a human being in this world who happens to be Jewish, and I go into a space where, my identity in many ways, Israel's very much tied up to the Jewish identity, and different people can argue different things, and that's fine. But historically, it has been, and in our prayers, it is. But I'm being presented as an it's showing me, even if let's say I was anti-Israel, which I'm not, but just inherently as like a Jewish person, that is how they see me. And it's very frightening, and you walk in, and I was very disturbed by this presentation. This is a school and a place of learning. It's a permanent, it wasn't an installation, it was permanent. And it's a little frightening, and we go and we talk about it. I'm like, oh, this makes me feel so uncomfortable. This makes me feel, I don't really like that, but it's okay. Like, as long as we keep our heads down, like, we'll be okay. And, this is when I was like, 18. And I told my Israeli friend about this, who she lives in Israel and she's Israeli. And she's like, why don't you guys just get a ladder and rip it down? And that showed me the quintessential difference between, there's more history in my family about this, between the Israeli Jew and at least back in the day, and the everybody else who kind of went to
sorry, continue. I have sort of my take on this.
And what I mean about that is not currently, but I'm saying post-Holocaust. And this is actually, I heard this from my grandfather. We asked our grandfather why, after the Holocaust, Israel was taking Jews. There was a lot of complicated things around that, but let's just say that's exactly just what was happening. And we're like, why didn't you go to Israel? Why did you go to Europe? Why did you go to Canada? And he said, because I knew if I went to Israel, I would have to fight. And he was in Auschwitz, you know what I mean? Like it was not a fun time. But he was like, I knew I would have to fight. And I realized the culture in Israel is people who went there post-Holocaust, they were like, we are going to fight. Versus, European Jews, and also these are brave. I'm not minimizing they're still brave, incredible, strong people. But there is, the European mentality until then was basically like, we'll hide under the table while we're murdered and raped. Like that's what was happening, and they had no defense. And, Jews were small people, and we were very malnourished. Like my siblings were like, and my dad were the tallest, like my grandfather was like, you guys are the tallest Hirschkopfs ever to exist. You guys are he's like, was so excited by that fact. And me and my friends actually today, we were talking about how all of our families, our grandparents and our uncles and aunts are very short, but our immediate families are actually very tall. It's because finally we have food, But so sorry, I got so far on the tangent. So basically going into a space where I know that I'm perceived in a certain way, it's very frightening. And as I've gotten older, I've seen the difference between those two, which is like, are we hiding under the table, hoping not to get hurt, or are we going to fight and we might also get hurt? I mean, not that I'm fighting, and there are people that are, but or am I just going to be like, this is who I am, and like if you come at me, at least I'm me when you come at me, and I'm not apologist about that. Because I've found myself in scenarios where I've been asked in many ways to be apologist, and let's not even talk about politically, just religiously. And I think also I'll say a lot of people are religious, and I think religious Muslims probably, especially if they're a person of color, probably experience this a lot. I can't speak to too many other religions, but I'm certain 100% it happens. And that's just like, and it's a problem. And I don't remember what the question was.
It was the mural. It was the mural. I mean, that point is, again, that was exactly sort of my perception. The stereotype is, and again, like you could say this, what I'm going to say is a bit of a negative stereotype, but it was sort of not based on nothing, which was right. Like the idea of these Ashkenazi Jews is they're very bookish, they're very kind of shy, like they're going to be, a lawyer, a banker, like they're not a soldier, they're kind of like thin and wheedly. And
also, we are not bred for strength. We are bred for reading. That is what we are bred for. And IBS and reading. That's what we are bred for.
Yes, reading.
That's it. That's what we're bred for.
And that's kind of, the stereotype that you're very non-athletic. You're very just like, no, I just want to read indoors and like my health.
That is the Ashkenazi Jew. It's not accurate.
And it's like not accurate. And then the stereotype of the Israelis are these military badasses who are like against all odds, they prevailed. And like they're like the Spartans.
And it's true. Though.
Yeah, it is true.
And they did.
They're really intense people,
Israelis listen,
they don't screw around.
Yeah, and listen, if you meet a, Israeli who maybe, originally came from Europe, they're Israeli. Israeli are Middle Eastern people. You go to Israel, you will not be confused. I mean, they're the kindest, most wonderful people, but like they will shove you out of a bus if they need to get on. I mean, it's a different culture. Completely. Like pushiness and whatever, and not being shy. Like my Israeli friends, I have friends who they spent some time in Canada and then they went to Israel. They're blunt. It's a cultural thing. They're very blunt. They're very, but they're also Middle Eastern Jews. So if you want to argue with them, they're going to argue with you because they're also still Jews. But there is, there's a culture where, they grew up in a world where, like when I was a kid, I lived in Israel for a little bit, and that it was and there were attacks like every day. And, I lived there for a year. And that was when like a lot of stabbings were happening all around, and you just have to decide, like, if I'm going to be here, then I can't be afraid. And I need to just, listen, and I'll give a perspective that I don't think a lot of people hear, which is like my sister's a nurse in Israel. I have two sisters. They're both nurses in Israel. And we can talk about the politics it's tragic. An 18-year-old boy, a Palestinian, went to Jerusalem and started stabbing civilians. And, he ended up getting a little, I think he hit his head, some sort of head injury occurred when he was being detained.
From, stabbing everyone.
Yeah, and my sister was actually put in charge of taking care of him. Oh. And it was very difficult for her, because on one end, she's like, this is an 18-year-old child. This is a child. And in no world should 18-year-olds are still a child. Even though they're in the army, even though they can... Talk to an 18-year-old, go to a high school, talk to somebody who just graduated. They are children, regardless. And that's the same for soldiers in the Israeli military. People see them as like these big adults. They are all children. And so this is, one end, this is a child, but also this is a child that's been, radicalized and went and murdered people. And you know what? In the hospital, she was giving him sponge baths. And she said it was very, and she, the stabbing happened in an area where she lived, And she said it was very difficult for her because on one end, this is like a child, but also she saw that like he was being given the best care in the entire hospital, like all the heads, because they came to like talk to him and all the heads of the hospital, and they all speak Arabic. And she's also working with, Arab and Muslim, coworkers, and they're trying to, garner some sort of trust and some sort of peace. And, another girl, there's a story that, almost all kind of Jewish people knows because it was a big thing that happened, but very, in early 2000s, a girl, it was her wedding day, and she went with her father to go get some food in the morning, and there was a terrorist attack, and they were both killed. And another time, a terrorist came into my sister's hospital, and that terrorist was assigned to a woman that was her sister that was murdered, and this was the terrorist that had killed her sister. And she was charged with caring for this person. And I don't remember if she was switched out, but they still cared for him. And I think that these human stories, where these are just like, at the end of the day, people are just people who want peace, and nobody, wants it. But we're going on a hold. Sorry. These are just things that I'm very passionate about.
That's the point.
We live in a world, and where you look at, I don't think it's this 18-year-old. Meaning, at the end of the day, you have to take responsibility for actions. But I don't think it's this 18-year-old boy's fault that he was militarized and he did this thing. He probably grew up in horrible conditions, and he grew up in a world where the leaders that were supposed to take care of him did not take care of him, and then radicalized him, and then sent him off to, luckily he didn't, it wasn't to the point where he had to get killed, but he wasn't a suicide bomber, and the Israeli, the police that took him down didn't have to kill him, and they didn't kill him. But, we live in a world where, people don't realize that it's the leaders that are just hurting their own people. There were, when I was in Israel for the year, there were tunnels, or that was when they were building the tunnels, these terrorist tunnels into Israel. And the whole thing was the concrete they're using to build the tunnels had been sent by Israel to them to build hospitals. And I'm not saying, the people on the ground who are just trying to live their lives and they're just doing their best. It's not on them. It's on the leaders that are so intent. Golda Meir said this, it's not a direct quote, but she's basically, the war will never end until they love their children more than they hate ours. And it's really sad. And even if everybody wants to make peace, it would still be complicated. It still would be very complicated. A lot of hurts, a lot of anger. But it's complicated. And when people make it as simple as oppressor, oppressee, even as, I went to a Zionist school, we never learned, Jews, good guys, everybody else, bad guys. That is not how we are taught it in school. We are taught the history and the nuance and about, the logistical law. Look, you've seen so far, I'm not the most educated person, all these things, but I know about annexation of land. Because they talk about, during the 6-Day War, when they got land in certain areas, why did they choose not to annex like Yehuda and Shomron, or Judah and Samaria? Why do they choose not to do that? And it's complicated, and it's how we ended up in the situation today. And I think that it's a very complicated situation, and it's very painful. But I don't like how I see it becoming inflamed on campuses, where it becomes less about finding solutions and finding ways for the communities to connect to each other, and it becomes more about overarchingly, there's very few Jews, proportionately, but it comes all about anti-Semitism. And that circling back really is, now that I'm not on campus, even though there are people being stabbed, I'm a lot less afraid on the daily. Being on campus at UCLA, I don't know as much. We were in our masters. We weren't really there during the day, but in Toronto, I know friends who got barricaded into rooms when speakers came. It was very frightening.
I wouldn't, if I were Jewish, I wouldn't go to UC Berkeley, for example. I just wouldn't go there. I wouldn't go there at all. And I'll say that on record. I wouldn't go there. UCLA, I've always generally thought is a bit more chill.
I don't know as much.
Southern California, and even going back like decades, I always thought Southern California is a little bit more chill than the northern certain enclaves in Northern California, which will again remain nameless on some of this crazy stuff. But I absolutely, it's a problem everywhere increasingly on campuses, and it's something that I find increasingly very reprehensible, especially in the way people who are supposedly these learned professors are weaponizing their positions to basically manipulate the minds of, to go off your point, children, basically, youths, on these sort of crazy kind of intellectual campaigns.
And the thing is, I get it. You know, if I wasn't Jewish and I hadn't been, not Jewish, if I hadn't gone to Jewish day school where they were like, here's the nuances and it's complicated. If I hadn't been taught that and I was just a regular person who went to school and they were like, look at these oppressors, oppressees, I'd be like, yeah, that's like, it seems so clear cut, you know, and there's this narrative and I really get it. Like, I do get why it happens, but it's like one of these things where it's like, oh man, like if you understood the history of how we got here, and there's so many, you know, like we know there's this whole, in Israel is considered a tragedy, there's this area called Gush Katif, which was, they had all these greenhouses. I know people who lived there, and what happened was they were really living in harmony with their, and at the time, they weren't Israelis, but they're Arab neighbors, and they worked with them, and, you know, they were creating a flourishing area, and you know, the prime minister ended up giving up that land, you know, and, you know, they literally dragged Jews out of their homes. And what happened was that all of the Arabs who had been working and farming with the Jews, they were all murdered by like incoming group. I don't want to say what, I don't know like exactly what group, and I don't want to, but they were all killed because they were working with Jews. And it's like, and that's why when I'm
and to be clear, this group is not the Israeli army.
Not the Israeli army.
This is another group
This is another
that was fighting the Israeli army.
And they ended up destroying, they ended up breaking all the infrastructure that had been left completely in place. And the stories I've heard these from, these aren't military people. This is like a mother who is like talking to me, who I'm like meeting in synagogue, and she's like, yeah, like this is what happened. And we haven't heard hide or hair of our friends from there, and like they're dead. They're dead.
When was this?
This was, I think it was like early, it was like early 2000s.
Early 2000s, okay.
It was between, I think, like 2000, 2005, I think. But it's considered like a very, you know, it's, you know, when it was happening, everybody was talking about it, and it just like very, very complicated and very sad. And, you know, when you're on campus, you know, when people are saying you murdered our babies, and you're like, okay, let me talk about the nuances of this. There's no space for that conversation. And Jewish students tend to be, at least if you went through an Orthodox school, we tend to be, at least they try to really educate us on this. And so we're very unequipped when we enter these spaces, when people are just like, you murdered a baby. And it's like, well, I didn't. But also, like, our babies have been murdered also. And no death of any person should ever be, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. It doesn't matter. No life should ever be lost. But it's like, yeah, well, let's talk about the complicated socio-political and social issues that are making it that we can never have peace, which then feeds into anti-Semitism abroad.
Yes.
So it's complicated.
Well, and also because, in my honest opinion, having gone through some of these, you know, programs where they, in early 2000s, I wouldn't have said it was full-on indoctrination, but in some of these history classes where, let's just say, they are not exactly giving you an even-keel description of history as it took place, and they are favoring, let's say, certain non-Western empires in their depictions of what happened.
And the whole thing is that, like, Israel is framed as like a Western, it's Western in terms of democracy, but it's not, like, Jews are not European. You know, when I have people come up to me basically looking for, let's say, for example, like a little bit of like, you know, an apology for slavery, I'm like, I wasn't here. I was being oppressed. You know, all of my siblings, you know, I went to Auschwitz and I looked at, there's a book of all the names of people who were killed there. All of my siblings were named after people who were killed, and I'm looking through this book, and every single one of my siblings' full names are in that book. Like, you know, sorry, a lot of tangents. This is like, whew.
Well, that's the thing though, because people aren't talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
And that's why it very much irks me, because there are sort of these little guideposts that have been set up in terms of acceptable discourse, which is completely not the range of what should be acceptable discourse, with these sort of narratives that are being force fed to people and said and being told, like, this is the narrative. Also, we believe in all these different narratives, but only this narrative. And if you don't believe in this one, then you're terrible. So it's not surprising that there's a lot you got to get off your chest, because it's not exactly every day that in these, you know, so open-minded spaces, which are the antithesis of, you aren't able to talk about these sorts of things. You know, and also, I mean, as we all know, I think that when you start playing the oppressor-oppressed game, it's one of the worst games you can play in human history.
And I could easily come here and be like, do you know what happened in Israel during the 6-Day War? there were like no people in every country around came to murder them. And, you know, we can flip the oppressor oppressed story back and forth. But as long as we talk in those terms, no one will ever be able to have peace, because as long as you're like, that group is an oppressor, it has to flip. There's no way for it to equalize. It always has to flip, right? And I mean, it's, you know, it's a complicated topic, but we have to start talking about it in complicated terms.
We do.
Or else it's just, even in America, you know, we're not even talking about in Israel, in the Middle East, even just our own perceptions of it until we talk about it more nuanced, and it's never going to change. And that's not to take away from the experience of like, you know, Palestinian children who are growing up in horrific situations, because, you know, and there's a lot of reasons behind that, and none of that is their fault, and they shouldn't have to suffer the brunt of that. And I've never met like a Jew. I met one girl, young, she was a teenager, and I think her family had been impacted through terror, but I've never heard any Israeli or Jew be like, we should just, because you know what, when you go to Israel, this is something that I think is people don't know, and I think it's so interesting. When you go to Israel, right, you drive up to Jerusalem, there are, they usually don't take, but there's a whole history around this, but when Israel was made a state, a lot of, we call them Arabs because they didn't take Israeli citizenship. It's a little bit complicated, but there are a lot of Arabs towns all throughout Israel, and there's cities, and they're huge, and they're beautiful, and I can't really speak personally to how beautiful they are, because Jews aren't allowed in them, and if you go, they're like, you're gonna get killed. But when you drive into Jerusalem, there's, you know, all over, there's mosques, and you go into Jerusalem, there's mosques, and you know, if you are Muslim and if you are Arab, if you're Palestinian, you can walk in any Jewish town and you are fine. I can't go into, I'm warned off against going into the Arab quarter in Jerusalem because it's not safe for me as a Jewish person. And the other thing is, people don't realize there's a lot of conversation about the Dome of the Rock. So let me explain. In Israel, there is the Western Wall. And behind it, and what's the Western Wall? For Jews, we used to have a temple there, and there's historical, archaeological proof of all of this. And there were 4 walls around the temple. So we worship now, not worship, I wouldn't use that word. It's a very holy site for Jews, just the wall that was outside the temple. The temple was inside, this is the wall. This isn't the wall of the building, this is the wall outside the building. And Temple Mount is behind the wall, and that's where our holiest physical location. Jews aren't really so much about physical locations like in terms of worship or anything like that, but that is our holiest site, period. In Islam, it's not exactly the holiest site, but it is our holiest site. And Jews are not allowed, legally, are not allowed onto the Temple Mount. This is in, if you're looking at Israel, this is in what people perceive, it is the Jewish state. In the center in Jerusalem, there are areas that Jews are legally not allowed to go, but like, you know, if you're Muslim, if you're Palestinian, you're allowed to go into these areas, and that's enforced by Jewish police. Like if I try to go up there, and they know, like, you know, not Jewish police, I'm sorry, I should not say Israeli police. The Israeli police force would not let me go into the Temple Mount in the center of Jerusalem. And people don't, and there's a mosque up there, right? And that's fine, that's beautiful, and I don't have issues with their, you know, listen, our religions can, you know, live in peace, and we have, and there's histories and whatever. But I'm just saying, you know, when people say like, Israel is just ethnic cleansing, Israel's doing this, it's like, walk the streets of Jerusalem, see where Jews are and aren't allowed to go, because in Israel, there's a lot of places Jews aren't allowed to go, and it's not the other way around. It really, and there are areas in Israel where there are signs, it's like, if you enter this area in Israel, if something happens, Israel can't get you out. And this is in Israel. This is on Israeli annexed, legally, you know, owned land. And people don't understand. They just don't understand what's going on. And you know, and listen, that's not to say that you know, there are, you know, you go to Tel Aviv and there's people of all religions and all ethnicities. You go to Jerusalem, there's all ethnicities. I'm not saying that it's always easy for, you know, for people who are Arab Israeli. You know, there are some complicated things, and, you know, there are some political things, and I can't really speak to those, but they're in the same classes, they're in the same schools, they're eating at the same restaurants, and you don't see that, like, point to like a Muslim country where primary, where there are Jews, because there's maybe there are some Jews left, but No, there's like none.
There's not a
none.
single. There's not a single.
There aren't Jews. I did hear. I don't know if this is true. I saw a headline. I just think it's funny where they said in Afghanistan there are 2 Jews left, and they were put in prison by the Taliban. I don't know why. I don't know what. Can't speak to it. But this is a headline. I don't know if it's true. I didn't read the article, but it said that the last remaining Jews in Afghanistan were freed from prison because the Taliban couldn't handle how much they were arguing. They were fighting too much. It was making too much noise, and they were like, just get out of here. I don't know if it's true. It was a headline, but it feels true. It feels true to me as a Jew. It feels true. I just thought that was funny. But that's what people also don't realize is that like when you walk in Israel, there's all colors, all races, all peoples, all languages. Literally in Jerusalem, it's the Jewish quarter, the Muslim quarter, and Muslims and everybody's allowed in all the corners, and the Armenian. Thank you, Armenian quarter, and it's crazy diverse. And you walk the streets of Jerusalem, and there's mosques everywhere doing call to prayer all throughout the day. There's even a political, this is a great story. I don't know, can't name names. I'm very bad at naming names, but people were complaining about the volume of the calls to prayer because they would go out, also very early in the morning and wake people up. And the politicians were saying like, we're not going to do anything about it. Like, we're just going to let, them do the call to prayers as loud as they want. And then one politician, what he did is he put speakers on his car and he went past like all the political leaders' houses, and at the times of call to prayer, he would blast the call to, just so they could experience it.
They could see how annoying this is.
Yeah, but and that's not me saying that the calls of prayer are annoying. This is just for me to show, to give an example of the fact that it's so common to have mosques everywhere that are practicing and have their public calls to prayer. It's not that they were saying let's stop their calls to prayer, because people are allowed to practice religion and any religion they want to in Israel. It's that it was so prevalent that it was too loud. That was the issue. It was too loud. They needed to make it a little bit quieter. And you do when you're walking Jerusalem. It is really loud, the calls to prayer. It never really bothered me, but I don't really live in Jerusalem. So, but it just to show things are more complicated. I'm not saying things are and therefore these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. It's white, black and white, done. But I'm saying is everything is more complicated.
It is. Well, on that note, I think that was a great note to end on. We keep it going in maybe another episode. I'd love to have you back on at some point and get into more of these issues. There's a lot to talk about. I mean, an hour and a half just flew by. So yeah. So Rachel Hirschkopf, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. This is really fun and exciting.
Yeah, and for those of you who thought that our discussion was interesting, we'd love to get your thoughts. Strike up a little bit of discussion in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, or maybe you've unsubscribed after this video, and that's fine. In which case, you know what? Fine. No worries. And we'll see you next time for more interesting discussions.